The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents an interview with Dr. Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne is a professor of biology at the University of Chicago in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. He has a Ph.D. from Harvard University and has served as both president and vice president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. He maintains a blog called Why Evolution is True, which shares a title with his best-selling book that aims to explain evolution to the public. In addition to his blog, scientific papers, and articles that have been published in major magazines and newspapers, he's recently released a new book called Faith versus Fact. Dr. Coyne was in Austin and graciously agreed to stop by the studio for this interview. So, Jerry, welcome. Thanks for coming down here.
Good to be here.
We first met at Imagine No Religion 5 in Vancouver and only got to talk, briefly, so it was really nice to hear that you were coming down to Austin. I guess I should probably start. You are a professor of biology at the University of Chicago. And you've done a lot of writing about biology in the sciences. Your more recent book is Faith versus Fact, which delves into the conflict between science and religion, which we'll get to. As a bit of a kind of a fun question, why aren't we done with biology? What is there left for us to discover about life?
Well, if we knew that, then we'd already knew what we were going to discover. John Horgan wrote a book called The End of Science, I guess about 15 years ago, I'm not sure, but he claimed that like all the important stuff had been done, not just in biology, but in physics and chemistry and things. And this has happened periodically through the history of science where people proclaim, okay, there's nothing more to be discovered. But since then, look what's happened in the past 20 years in biology. We have the human genome sequence. In physics, we've discovered dark matter and dark energy. And the problem is, it's not a problem, it's what keeps us going actually, is that we don't know what's to be found. What fossils will be dug up there's a controversy about whether dinosaurs came from birds. The other way around, birds came from dinosaurs. Most people go with the dinosaur theory, but there's a vocal minority that claims otherwise, that birds are not dinosaurs, and that's ultimately probably going to be settled by fossils that we haven't found yet. And who knows what kinds of fossils we're going to find. We're going to decode the genomes of lots of species, and we'll find out the true evolutionary relationships of many things. We mentioned earlier today that we know now that falcons are more closely related to parrots than they are to other raptors, which is a complete surprise. Now, it may not be an earth-shaking discovery, but it's a surprise that's coming. The origin of life is something that everybody wants to know about. We don't know how it happened. We may not know exactly how it happened, but we may, in fact, I think we will discover in the next couple of decades how to do it in the laboratory under early Earth conditions, which would, of course, silence the theists that say it couldn't have happened naturally. Consciousness, the mysteries of the brain, that's one of the biggest black boxes in biology. Where does consciousness come from? What are the neurological correlates? And there's the interface between biology and philosophy, ideas of free will. How far in advance can you predict somebody's decision before they're conscious of having made it? So science is nowhere near its end. We're scraping the surface, we're making a lot of progress, but it's hard to predict what's going to happen because things that overturn worldviews happen all the time.
So given what we understand about life and biology and evolution, is there, as we move forward and we start comparing genomes, we're able to map out the tree of life much more accurately, as you were talking about, by identifying which species are more closely related to others, so that instead of going off of morphology, we can go off of actual genetics. And I find all that fascinating. I think one of the reasons we talked about what's the practical benefit of going to the moon? Well, it turns out there's not one for going to the moon, but learning how to go to the moon gets us a practical benefit.
Yeah.
Is there something similar in biology? By learning about how life is interrelated, we may not necessarily get a practical benefit out of it, but we might get real tangible benefits with regard to treating diseases and...
Yeah, well, that would come from the Genome Project itself, which was basically like a space exploration project. When it started, the idea was that maybe we'd have the ancillary benefits of curing disease and stuff, but it was basically an exploration whose benefits could not be predicted. One of those benefits, which was the unraveling of the tree of life, so that's a side project. I'm not sure how that will provide practical benefits, but the technology to do that will. There's also, the barcoding, the way to identify species very quickly, is a tool that people like to use in conservation or claim that it's useful in conservation. I don't know much about that, but certainly, the Genome Project and the technology used to do it now has all these possibilities. And there's things that people have discovered, like the CRISPR method, where you can actually snip out part of a gene and put in exactly in that spot the healthy gene. So it's possible now to cure genetic diseases in people in a way that's permanent, so that their offspring won't have them. So, I like to, evolution does have practical benefits in terms of being able to trace epidemics using DNA. I mean, David Hills at the University of Texas has implicated the famous dentist who infected his patients by using phylogenetic methods to trace the sequence of the HIV virus as it mutated. You could show it all goes back to, one original sample. But evolution, I like to think of as more of a man on the moon kind of project for biology. It's something that we just have to do because we want to understand our ancestry. It's, Beth mentioned earlier that she's into genealogy and stuff. Well, evolution is the ultimate genealogy.
Yeah.
It tells where everything came from, not just us. And we're just obsessively curious about it. We've discovered now that Neanderthals mated with Homo sapiens early on, and we each of Caucasians carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA.
So we've actually gone back and forth on that issue where at one point Neanderthals were in our ancestry and then they weren't, and now we find that there's interbreeding, and so that there's some aspects of this.
Some, yeah.
This is a point that people who are possibly creationists or in some other way are dubious of science would say, look, the science was wrong. How can we trust it now? How do you respond to something like that?
Well, we should just admit from the outset as scientists that we could be wrong. We don't have a handle on absolute truth, as theists claim they do. What we find can change over time, and it has changed in my lifetime. For example, DNA was still thought to have been a protein by some people, and I mean the hereditary molecule is supposed to have been a protein. The continents were thought to be static. We had, no idea about string theory, although it may be wrong. But science has been wrong about a lot of things, and that's just what happens from the method of science, which is use your best guess based on the evidence you have, and then you get new evidence. We had no idea when I was a kid, for example, that, and I believe this is true, that birds are just dinosaurs that are highly evolved. I think that's probably the case. And people that said otherwise are probably wrong. It's inherent in the scientific method of using the best evidence you can that you're sometimes going to have evidence that you've missed or you interpreted things wrongly. That said, there are some things that we found out in science that are not going to change, which theists and other critics of science don't seem to realize. Like DNA is going to be a double helix 2,000 years from now. There's not going to be no discovery that changes that. Our closest living relative is the chimpanzee. I can't imagine that changing. The formula of water is H2O. So science sometimes hits on things that we would consider absolute truths by almost any standard. Absolute truths in the sense that Anthony Grayling uses, that you would bet your house on there being unchangeable things. So when people claim that science is a dubious practice because it's sometimes wrong, they're ignoring all the things that are right and have been right for hundreds of years and are very unlikely to change.
The thing that always strikes me about it is that we had a proposed model of the world, and we found out that some aspect of it was wrong. And the way we found that out was by doing more testing and gathering more information. So now we have refined the model. It may be dramatically different from what came before, but it seems to me that even in those changes, it becomes increasingly less likely that we're going to dramatically change the newer models, that there'll be more subtle changes as we progress towards a correct understanding.
I think you're saying we're asymptotically approaching something that's not going to change much more. Yeah, that's possible. I mean, in biology, you're probably right. There's not surprises in biology, I think, that are of the nature of string theory. But look at physics, though. We have dark matter and dark energy. I mean, that's not just an asymptotic approaching of the truth. That's something that just came out of left field that we don't know about. String theory might be right. They may discover a way to unify all the four forces of physics that we have no idea. So if there is something that, biology may go like this, physics may go like this, and and approaches truth in sort of a punctuated equilibrium manner.
I think that makes a really good point, is that a lot of people, when we talk, even I do it, we talk about science, we tend to portray science as this, monolithic thing, and really there are the sciences, and each of them have their different methods, they have their different, accuracy levels and all of those things. It may be a mistake. I remember when I was a kid, we were taught the scientific method.
Yeah.
And now most of us understand there's not one scientific method. It's not just hypothesis, and working towards thesis. That the way we do things and verify things is a lot more complicated because the world is more complicated.
Yeah, I think it was Lacatus, who's a philosopher in Berkeley, that said anything goes as a scientific method, and that's more or less true. I talk about that in my book a bit. I mean, the method that we were taught, hypothesis, that's completely wrong in some instances. Darwin, for example, did not have a hypothesis of evolution when he went on the Beagle. He collected facts and gradually from the facts formed his hypothesis.
Right.
And then that led to further predictions that could be tested. So that's, fact gathering, hypothesis, and testing, which is the inversion of the way it's usually supposed to go about. But the only commonality, all these sciences are different in the way they do statistics and the degree of rigor that they have, but they all have something in common, and that's the use of empirical evidence, the use of rationality, the use of replication of experiments. You're only as good as the next person that tests you can be. The use of peer review and adjudicating what you do. So there's, it's just the commonality of rationality, consensus, testing, and of course appealing to empirical facts. A science is not a science unless it has something to do with the real world.
And there's we constantly strive to eliminate as many biases as we can.
Yeah, which is the difference between science and religion. Science is exquisitely constructed to prevent you from finding out what you want to find out. It's the worst thing you can do as a scientist, that you seek to confirm what you already believed beforehand. Whereas that's the métier of the religious. That's their whole modus operandi, is just to seek to confirm what they believed in the beginning. Whereas the good scientists, and granted we're all humans and we have our favorite hypothesis and like to find out it's true, but if you let that condition the way you do your methods, you're going to wind up in trouble, because somebody's going to try to replicate what you do and they're not going to find the same thing.
And sometimes it's going to be far more valuable and informative to find out that you were in fact wrong.
Yeah. That's true. A lot of famous scientific discoveries. Yeah, the discovery of quantum mechanics was like that. When you find an anomaly in black body radiation, all of a sudden it opens up this whole new world. That's a good example of where you can never predict that science will go.
I have a physicist friend who was really hoping that they would not be able to confirm the Higgs boson as they were looking for it, because of the potential doors that would open in investigating that. Hey, we were wrong about something. Let's go find out what it was.
Yeah. Well, physics has a history of being wrong about him. String theory may not be wrong, but it may not be testable either. So it may go the way of. That's another thing with science. If you can't test a really interesting and good hypothesis against the real world, then ultimately you have to discard it. And that's what's basically happened in string theory, which was so exciting about 15 years ago, and nobody's found a way to empirically test it. And so it may ultimately disappear as a theory.
So you mentioned your new book, which is Faith versus Fact. Previously, you'd written Why Evolution is True, which is a great kind of important book that I think anybody could read and come away with a better understanding of evolution. But I think when we talk about this book, can we start by having you kind of give your definition or definitions of faith and fact as you're referencing them in the book?
I'll probably run into trouble with philosophers who are really hidebound to definitions. Faith I use, you can look at the Bible. Faith is the belief in things not seen. If you want to use, I think it's Hebrews 1, 11. You know that better.
I think it's 11:1, but either way, one of us is right, probably.
And, it is believing in something where there is not sufficient evidence to warrant the confidence you have in that belief. As Mark Twain said, it's believing, his is facetious, believing in what you know ain't true. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But it's believing in things where you don't have the kind of confidence you'd use in other aspects of your life to proclaim something true. So that's what I call faith. Fact is basically something about the world that any rational person, or the vast majority of rational people, would agree is true, but that have sufficient knowledge to be able to verify the existence of that thing. A dictionary definition would differ, but I'm using them, and basically the common sense
Yeah, there's
term word.
I can't count the number of discussions we've had about, well, what do you mean by faith? Well, what do you mean by faith?
Yeah.
And we did just the other night. The subtitle of the book, though, is Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of discussion about this. We go back to Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria. We have people at the Discovery Institute and other old Earth creationists who are trying to find a way to get their particular version of religion to mesh with the science. And the Catholic Church accepts evolution, and I almost want to put that in air quotes because they have some tampering. If you can, just kind of give us an overview of your thoughts on this and where you go in the book.
Yeah, the main thesis is what I mean by incompatible, and it's not that you can be a religious scientist or you can be a lay person who is both religious and accepts science. That's just a matter of, compartmentalizing two disparate worldviews in your head. What I mean by compatibility is that there are worldviews that you can hold simultaneously without having mental contradictions. And in that sense, religion and science are incompatible in three ways. My first thesis is that both religion and science make statements about what is real about the cosmos of the world. So in that sense, religion makes epistemic claims. Now, some theologians don't agree with that. They say religion is about community, it's about harmony, it's about morality, etc. But the honest theologians think, and then we'll say that. And I document this copiously in the book, just because people are going to doubt it. I know they will, that it's about the real. They make statements about the real world, and by real world I mean how God, a supernatural being, affects the world. They make epistemic claims, and so does science. Sometimes those claims are in different areas, but they're nevertheless both about the way things are. So they're competing areas that make statements about reality, and my thesis is that only one of those areas, i.e. science, has a way to figure out whether the claims are true or not. So if you make a claim that DNA is a double helix, or that it replicates in a certain way, the famous Maselson and Stahl experiment, you can test that, and you have a way to show it's wrong. Whereas if you're a religious person, you make an empirical claim that we have souls, and those souls will go to heaven, or that you will only go to heaven if you believe in Jesus. There's no way to test those at all.
As soon as you start talking about an afterlife and any kind of possible afterlife, if you say, I'm going to go to an afterlife, now there's a necessary connection to the prime material plane or the natural world. And so I don't see how any religion that has anything to say at all about an afterlife could ever claim, oh, no, this has nothing to do with the natural world.
Yeah, I know. I mean, lots of preachers will claim, or even sophisticated theologians claim that, they are making statements about the natural world, but the way they adjudicate the way they adjudicate those claims differs from the way science does it. They have insulated their claims from disconfirmation. That's the way it is. They have an explanation for everything. So if you find something that claims to invalidate a religious claim, like evolution did in 1859, they can always adjust their theology to accommodate it. Or if you say that, a just God, we were talking about this earlier, wouldn't give children leukemia. Well, they'll make up some, reason why God would do that. But of course, they're just making stuff up. And so, and different religions make up different things. So they have all these incompatible claims. So in the end, they're doing exactly what you don't do in science, which is insulating what you want to believe from being disconfirmed by somebody else. So, the basic claim is that they both make empirical claims. Religion, of course, makes other claims about morality and communality, but I'm just talking about existence claims. And they differ in the outcomes of those claims, that science can actually show things to be true, whereas I would claim that theology has not hit upon any verifiable fact about the natural or supernatural in thousands of years. We don't know anything more about God than the ancient Greeks did. They differ in outcomes, they differ in methodologies. Science has this method of rigorous epistemic testing of your claims, and they sort of differ in philosophy. We talked yesterday about philosophical naturalism. Science has a philosophy where you do not include invocation of the supernatural unless it becomes absolutely necessary to do so. And at one time it did. Newton couldn't figure out why the planet planetary orbits were stable, so he said, well, God must keep them stable. That was a time when science really could invoke the supernatural as a way of explaining something you couldn't. But then.
But it was a mistake.
It was a mistake.
It was we didn't have enough information.
Yeah. And so that's why we reject the supernatural. Now it's not, and I should correct this for anybody that's watching. A lot of people, including my advisor Dick Lewington, say that science from the outset refuses to consider the supernatural. He's made a famous statement, which is trumpeted by all the creationists. We cannot allow a supernatural foot in the door. From the outset, we're hidebound naturalists, and that makes us look narrow-minded.
Yeah.
Because if the God exists and it's not beyond possibility, logical possibility that a deity exists, then how can you say that, it's like being an atheist and saying, I know God doesn't exist. Being a scientist saying, I know the supernatural doesn't exist, and so therefore we're not going to consider it. Well, that's not the way it really works. The reason we exclude the supernatural these days from science is because it's never proven to help us understand anything. I mean, Newton had an explanation based on supernatural things, but it was explained naturally.
Was it Laplace, I think?
Laplace, his famous book. The story may be apocryphal,
right.
But
I had no need of that hypothesis.
And certainly today we know why the planetary orbits are stable. It's a purely naturalistic explanation. Diseases, epilepsy, as you know, was once thought to be a manifestation of demons, and we know now it's electrical impulses in the brain. So one by one, we've had to reject all the incursions of the supernatural from science. And so now it's just not useful to consider God when you're doing science. Just saying, well, this experiment didn't work because God didn't like me that day or something. So it's not that we rule it out of court from the beginning. It's that it has not been helpful at all. And this has led ultimately to the view of, philosophical naturalism. That's called methodological naturalism when you don't really consider the supernatural. Philosophical naturalism, I think, is the natural outcome of that, which is, if you reject supernatural intervention over and over and over again because it hasn't been helpful, you start to think, well, maybe there isn't anything supernatural. And then that becomes philosophical naturalism, which many people adhere to, which is the view that there doesn't seem to be any supernatural forces at work
that the natural is all there is.
Yeah, all there is. So,
and I think that's at least a position. There are no positions that I think we should assert with absolute certainty,
yes.
but reasonable confidence based. How many times do you have to test something and have it fail before you say, you know what, you need to come up with something new before I'll even consider that a possibility again?
And yet science still considers testing the supernatural. I mean, Jeannie Scott and I, she's the head of the National Center for Science Education. She's a really effective combater of creationism. She and I have argued about this for years. She claims you can't test the supernatural, so that religion and science are separate areas. This is her view because, supernatural makes claims that are simply not testable. And so it's outside the ambit of what science can do. And yet we talked about this again, intercessory prayer, the studies that have been funded by the Templeton Foundation and other foundations.
I think there she would argue, as others probably would, that what we're testing is the physical manifestation that is being attributed to a supernatural cause.
Rather than the existence of the
We need some mechanism by which we can verify the supernatural cause, and we're not aware of that one yet.
Yeah, well, that sounds a bit fatuous to me. I mean, God is that, well, at least you can falsify the idea that God answers prayers. And if God is supposed to have effects in the world, as all theists believe, and you can't show those effects, then time after time after time again, well, what do you say? Well, you can say, well, there might still be a God and we just haven't. I think the more reasonable view is, well, I think Deleuze McCowan, the philosopher, said that the invisible and non-existent look very much alike. But, there's lots of ways you can test this. And we continue to. We test for the existence of ESP, paranormal phenomena. We look for UFOs. We test for intercessory prayer. We've done tests of dowsing. There's all kinds of, not just religion, but paranormal phenomena, which I consider basically all faith-based phenomena, and none of them have panned out.
So since this project's primarily about debates, and as we're all aware, not just formal debates, but hey, you're at home with relatives and Uncle Bob says, evolution's a fairy tale for grown-ups. One of the things I'd like to touch on is, when you encounter people who, some of them may be just completely anti-science. They're so entrenched in their religious ideas that it doesn't matter what science has to say. If it disagrees with what I already believe, it's wrong. There are others who seem to be willing to accept science. They just have a horrible understanding of the topic. And so when you run across somebody who says, "Oh, evolution is just a fairy tale for grown-ups," how do you deal with that?
Well, you have to make a preliminary assessment of how open they are to evidence. And the vast majority of people like that are going to be creationists and they're not going to be open to evidence. So if you just randomly try to teach such a person the evidence for evolution, the chances are you're going to fail. So I prefer not to waste my breath on them unless they show some real curiosity, some possibility that they might be wrong in their assessment. If they do that, if there's a crack or an opening, then I would be, and I get emails like this all the time. I'm confused about this. I want to believe in evolution, but I can't, but creationists say this, can you help me out? And then I will answer those. If somebody comes up to me in the street and just disses evolution, the chances that I would change their mind are nil. And this is one reason why I prefer not to debate creationists, because most of the audience are closed-minded and it's based on rhetoric. I prefer to do my education through writing, because if people are really curious about evolution, they'll find a way to learn about it. In fact, a lot of former believers that have told me that they've come around to evolution have studied evolution because they want to know their enemy when they're religious, and they read about it and they find, wow, there's some evidence for this stuff, and then eventually they become evolutionists. So I'd prefer to lay out the evidence in a calm and dispassionate place where people can go to and adjudicate it, slowly, and let it assimilate into their mind. And those are the people that really change their minds, I think. You can't change somebody's mind in a conversation. Sure. You know that well.
There's a lot of great resources, Talk Origins and others, that'll list an index to creationist claims, and people can reference those. And I don't mean to put you on the spot and pluck facts out of thin air, but for somebody like me who is likely to be engaged in a debate with a creationist at some point, what in your mind are a few of the most compelling, obvious, simple to understand observations that confirm that we've got it essentially right when it comes to natural selection and evolution?
Well, when you say we've got it essentially right, you mean trying to convince somebody who doesn't accept evolution, the simplest and most convincing evidence that you can deduce?
The type of thing that when they say, "Oh, well, what is your evidence for evolution? Why would you believe something like this?" And I'm tempted to talk about the fusing of chromosome 2, and I'm talking, kind of vaguely talk about genetics. But I'm wondering if there's some aha, wow moments that in the process of refining our understanding of evolution that are just, you think are going to be so likely to be compelling to people to where they're like, wow, that doesn't make sense under my God view of world.
Yeah, well, there's two areas. Actually, there's three. But the most obvious is something we've had with us for a long time, and that's the fossil record. There was a BBC TV show called The Creationist Road Trip, where they took 5 British creationists across the United States and had them encounter various evolutionists. People like me, I lectured on biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals on the planet. I'll get to that in a minute. But this, and Don Prothero that explained the sedimentary process and how the fossil record is formed. But the stuff that really took them aback is when they took them to Tim White's lab at Berkeley, and he just lined up all the humans and hominin skulls from 6 million years ago up to the modern time in order of time. And they're this is carbon dated to this, or whatever the kind of dating they were using, and you line them up and you just see this inexorable process of the skull getting larger, the teeth getting smaller, the brow ridges getting smaller, and the creationists didn't really have much to say to that. What do you do when you line up all the skulls in order and you believe that humans were created in their present form, and you say, well, 3 million years ago, we didn't have any human skulls, but look, 1.5 million years ago, it's getting more and more human, and then, by the time of the Neanderthals, they're essentially humans. That stuff is hard to deny. You can do it with other fossils, but humans are, of course, the stuff we know what our skulls look like. You could do it with reptiles turning to mammals. You could do it for reptiles turning into birds. You could do it with Tiktaalik for fish turning into amphibians. And the predictability of that, saying, well, we thought that fish turned into amphibians about this time, and then we went back and looked at this particular missing time, and lo and behold, we find something that's
we made a prediction.
Yeah, now that's a little bit harder to understand. If you really want something tangible that you can hold in your hand and be convinced of evolution, I would say line up the human skulls in order. After that, you could do it with other fossils. You could look at the early whales, which were 50 feet long and had limbs about that long. Mm-hmm. They're completely useless. Since why would God give a marine animal legs that look exactly like, has the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the metatarsals, all the bones in the putative ancestor, and it's hard for them to come up with a reply.
I've heard stories though, like if you line up all the skulls for human history, and you ask them to draw the line, when were we ape and when were we human? If you ask the creationists to do this, that they'll draw the line in different places. The one question that I don't know if anybody asked as a follow-up was to have them describe why they're drawing that line. What is your reason for deciding this? Because they draw it in different places.
Before that they say they're just aberrant apes. Afterwards they'll say they're humans with rickets. And there's no asking them why they draw a line is going to be as embarrassing as asking them, why children die of leukemia if God is so beneficent. It's going to be a completely arbitrary, made-up answer. So, that's a good question, though. I haven't thought of asking a creationist that. There's other evidence, too, that I talk about in the book. Why evolution is true is accessible to almost anybody, even if you haven't had any biology. There's biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals on the surface of the earth. Why do we not have endemic, that is, animals that are limited to particular islands? Islands like Hawaii, the Galapagos, and the Azores, volcanic islands. If you look all around the world, they're lacking mammals, they're lacking endemic reptiles, they're lacking amphibians, they're lacking fish. But if you look on an island that's not an oceanic island, like Great Britain or the islands in the Bering Strait, they have those things. Now, ask a creationist, well, why did God put one set of animals on one kind of island and another? There's no explanation except that oceanic islands came up from beneath the sea, bereft of life, and then birds got there, and insects got there, and plants got there, but reptiles, amphibians, and fish, and mammals can't get there because they have to cross vast expanses of ocean. This is something that Darwin noticed, and I don't think any creationist has ever given a satisfactory explanation for it. It's a little bit more intellectually involved than just looking at fossils, but it's still some of the most irrefutable evidence for evolution that there is.
So you mentioned Darwin, and I know some creationists who constantly want to point out all sorts of things that are irrelevant and false, that Darwin recanted, or he was a racist, or he said this and it's wrong. While I don't want to diminish his input here, and it's amazing. I see creationists look at the finches and go, yeah, so what, it's a big change. And then they want to dismiss all this. But we've come so far from Darwin. Are we at a point where perhaps, at least in conversations with creationists, we just don't mention Darwin or don't call it Darwinian evolution? We talk about it with what we know now, so that we're not kind of falsely tied to mistakes. Or weird
Darwin. I don't call it Darwinian evolution. Sometimes I will. It's just slip out because it's such a common moniker in the field, or Darwin's theory of evolution. The fact is, however, I don't think we should cast ourselves adrift from Darwin, because on all the big 5 propositions of evolution, that things evolved gradually over periods of time, that it was a populational phenomenon, and then an individual didn't change into something different, the population transformed itself, that a lineage would split over time, so we'd have one ancestral species, the universal common ancestor, and over time it would branch into the branching bush of life. And if you trace that back, you could take any pair of twigs on the tree or bush of life and trace it back to common ancestor. And that the mechanism of change that creates the designoid or adaptive feature of organisms is natural selection. Darwin was right about all that. And those are still major parts of evolutionary theory. Now, he's wrong about genetics. He was wrong about some of his assertions about biogeography. Given, however, the abysmal state of our knowledge about biology at the time, he was remarkably successful. So, you can talk about the modern theory of evolution, but it's still deeply imbued with things like natural selection that came right out of the mind of Darwin. And, in that sense, he's probably the greatest scientist that ever lived, and that what he found still remains generally true in biology. Some of it was wrong. Nobody's ever been completely right, but the modern theory of evolution is basically Darwinian. With the overlay of all the modern stuff we know about genetics and DNA sequencing and biogeography, and the fossil record, which Darwin didn't have,
Right.
because there was not much of one. So I don't think, I think we just should admit Darwin was a scientist. He was wrong, and we're all wrong sometimes. But given what we knew at the time, he was about as right as somebody could be.
It was a remarkable way of thinking that,
Yeah.
you know, we don't have a lot of, whether or not he was the greatest scientist of all times, I don't think we have a lot of analogs to someone making perhaps an almost intuitive, reaching an intuitive conclusion based on what he's observing that makes a prediction about what we're going to find for the next 150 years as we explore this, and not getting it all absolutely 100% correct is, as you pointed out, not really surprising.
He was remarkably prescient. In my own, I read The Origin about every year or two, and in my own copy, I jot down all the stuff that we're still talking about and testing, like punctuated equilibrium, the theory that evolution proceeds in fits and starts rather than smoothly, is something that Darwin discussed as a throwaway line in The Origin. So I have this whole line of things that, you know, Darwin just said as an offhand remark that have become major fields of research in modern evolution. So I don't think we lose anything by tying ourselves to Darwin or recognizing his greatness as maybe...
Because we're doing it in the sense of, yeah, he was a scientist, he was wrong about some things, but he had a great mind and he came up with great ideas.
Yeah.
We're not tying ourselves to Darwin in the same way that they're tying themselves to Jesus or, you know, some whatever spokesperson for their religion it might be. Yeah. If we found out tomorrow, which seems impossible, if not incredibly implausible, that Darwin was wrong about everything and that our understanding of life and evolution were wrong, and we could demonstrate this, I think pretty much every scientist and every science-minded individual would say, yep, we were wrong. What the hell do we do now?
Yeah, well, we'll find out what really happened. I mean, you know, when Mendel came along and was rediscovered in 1900 independently by 3 people, people had no problem throwing away Darwin's discredited theory of, he had a Lamarckian theory that environmental influences on the animal would actually change its genome, and well, he didn't know what a genome was, but would change it's what it could pass on to its offspring. And he was wrong, and experiments showed it to be wrong, and then we discovered why he was wrong, and so we just, you know, that whole part of The Origin is no longer regarded as anything of any use.
So we talk about debates, and you said you tend to kind of avoid those debates. Should anybody be debating creationists, young Earth creationists? If so, who, why, or why not?
You know, my view is that debates are not, in general, at least, I think for, you know, the kind of debates you do about God and stuff, they're effective, especially if somebody who's actually been a member of the faith and can speak from that, like you. Very few evolutionists, in fact, none of them I know who debate creationists, were creationists. So what they're going to do is, I mean, they don't understand the creationist mindset. I'm not sure they would know how to appeal to a biblical audience, or even if it's possible to do that. My view is that twofold. First of all, you give unwarranted credibility to creationists if you debate them. I don't care who you are. If you're an evolutionist of any repute at all, just getting on the platform with them is an admission that, you know, they're worth debating. And second of all, you know, in terms of rhetoric, I mean, when a creationist debates an evolutionist, it's like sand is being thrown in the face of the audience. Stuff comes up about, you know, radiometric dating, about the fossil record, about the origin of life, and all this sand is being thrown in the eyes of the audience, and they can't adjudicate it. I mean, when you say, well, look, here's a living snail that carbon dating dates as 25,000 years old, so the whole process is worthless and dating method is wrong, you know.
Let's keep pointing to those outliers.
Yeah, and, you know, the audience doesn't know that, well, that snail was absorbing ancient limestone into its shell, so of course it's going to date like it was old. And maybe the scientist who's debating doesn't know that either, because few of us are experts in all the areas that encompassed by evolution: molecular biology, radiometric dating, geology, paleontology, you know, embryology, population genetics. So, for example, if I was shown some anomaly in the geological record by a creationist and said, well, explain that, you know, I might not be conversant with it. So I'd prefer that, you know, I let the experts in each field address these issues in themselves. I prefer that people who are really curious about evolution go and read about it. The website you mentioned, Talk Origins, is good. My book is good. There's a lot of books. Richard Dawkins has one. But in general, I haven't seen debates be very useful in changing people's minds. People can watch Bill Nye go after Ken Ham. I guess that's probably the most famous debate. I watched that, and Bill, who was on the evolution side, did a credible job, but I don't think he changed many minds in the audience, which was mostly creationists. And he sure raised a lot of money for the Ark Park and the Creation Museum.
I do like the fact, and I was opposed to that debate to begin with for many of the same reasons you were. I do like the fact, though, that it was at least one of, outside of presidential debates, probably the most watched debate in history, and the fact that it'll live forever on YouTube, because the one thing I took away from that, setting aside how good Bill did, is that Ken Ham may be just a terrible debater. I mean, there were openings and potential openings, and I think, Bill talked about theology when he had no business going there, where I'm sitting here thinking, oh, and now Ken's going to say this, and he doesn't. All he says is, I've got a book. And there's something about this major debate where this person is supposed to be there to challenge the findings of science, and they present absolutely no science and just point to their Bible.
Yeah, well, if you're a rational person, you would notice that, right?
And the hope is that we can move some people towards rationality in other ways and then show them the debate. And
yeah.
I like this idea of mirror neurons, that, somebody hits their hand with a hammer, and essentially the same neurons that cause pain in you would cause pain in me, except that there's something that prevents it from experiencing the pain. And I see this as applicable to empathy. And one of the things we know is if you see someone who holds your views embarrassed publicly while you're sitting there not a part of it,
embarrass you
feel that.
Yeah.
And what I've found from people is quite often they'll email and say, you really made me mad, and I think you're an ass, and you're rude to people and all this other stuff. But I set out to prove you wrong, and as it turns out, I ended up changing my mind. This process that encourages them to go out and explore, assuming they're at least given the tools to do that, maybe the single most productive element of a debate is what happens well afterwards, after you've planted seeds and stuff.
The question is, I suppose, whether theists would be embarrassed by Ken Ham's. It would take a lot to embarrass a Bible thumper, I think.
Some of them may not have been embarrassed in the slightest.
Yeah, I mean, given the foolishness that they believe, that the fossil record simply reflects sedimentation out of Noah's flood, it would be hard to embarrass somebody.
So is it the case probably that this topic, evolution, is so big, people like you have spent your entire lives studying it, it requires some foundational knowledge and understanding about the sciences that has to be built on, that it's just not the sort of topic that would ever do good in a debate?
I think so, not unless you had whole teams of debaters, because I don't know anybody, no evolutionary biologist that is an absolute master of all the evidence from all the, because as I said, evolution encompasses everything from what's going on in the DNA to the fossil record. You have to know about geology, molecular biology, vestigial organs, metabolism.
Yeah, let's condense that to a 20-minute opening and a 10-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, so, the only way to do that would be really to have a team of evolutionary biologists. You can have a team of creationists, they're all going to say the same thing. And every time one of the creationists makes an unwarranted statement, like, here's a cowboy boot that fossilized in 2 billion-year-old sediments, explain that, then you have the paleontologists get up and explain it. But the fact is that it's not like theism. I mean, somebody can master Christianity and most of its main arguments, but it would take several lifetimes to master all the things you need to do to answer the arguments that creationists would throw at you. So if you had a team debate with like 5 or 6 people in different areas ranging from molecular biology to fossils, then you might have a productive debate, and then you might get some major embarrassment on the part of the theists, because anytime they said something dubious, there'd be somebody who could correct them. But that's never happened, as far as I know.
And you mentioned a team of experts, and this kind of raises something that's been discussed on the side. You and I actually haven't talked about this, so this will be extra interesting for me, is we live our lives primarily by inference and induction, and we try to rightly rely on the experts who we should trust and ignore the proposed or dismiss the proposed experts that we shouldn't trust. And we can't all learn all of this stuff. I figured out after I gave up Christianity that I wanted to continue exploring this idea of God, but it would take multiple lifetimes to do so. So I started with Buddhism to find out if I was going to have multiple lifetimes. And then I went to kind of philosophy. Let's hit this from the bottom level. How do we do a better job of giving people, students in school on up to adults, the tools they need to be more effective at figuring out which experts are reliable, which ones aren't, and how much stock they should put in any of them?
Well, the thing that science has and theism doesn't is that the experts are continually vetting each other. So if a scientist says something dubious, he or she is going to be corrected by another scientist. So somebody who has a substantial reputation in the field, say like Don Prothero does in geology, or Tim White in the Human Fossil Record, you can pretty well trust them. Whereas a theist like William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga, or even somebody like Ray Comfort, they're not vetted by other theists who criticize them because they're all in the same boat. They don't want to criticize each other.
Or when they disagree, they form different boats. This is a new denomination, that one's wrong, and there's no resolution.
And there's really no vetting of theists because there's no way to decide who's right or not. Is there one God, or are there many gods, like Hindus say? So, we have no way of knowing that. So, my view is that there is that theologians rise to, I think Dan Barker's the one that said this, that theologians don't study the divine. They don't study what the nature and truth about God. They study what other theologians have said. So a theologian of great repute is somebody that knows what every other theologian has said and can spout it off. But that doesn't mean that he knows more about God than, whereas somebody like, Tim White knows more about the Human Fossil Record than most other people do, and you can verify that by checking his statements against other paleontologists and especially against nature. So, I think you can go generally by reputation in science. And the textbooks, they're well-regarded textbooks are good. A lot of people have said that courses in critical thinking would be really useful for kids if you could just get them to do that. Other people have said it's very hard to teach critical thinking. I don't know. I'm not an educator. I don't know about that. It would be great if you could give kids, different hypotheses and let them learn to sort out how you adjudicate them.
I'd love to see that kind of exploration stuff come up in schools because while I don't have evidence to support the idea, I think that's a good way. That's how we kind of discover things. And it reminds me not so much just teaching critical thinking in schools or even skepticism, but it seems to me that we've perhaps lost the sort of encouragement to wonder and adventure and explore when we're educating based on here's what the test is going to be, here's the right answer. We're teaching people what to think more than how to think and how to explore. And I don't have any more of an answer on that than anybody else does.
Yeah, well, education is becoming more of a commodity than a learning experience now. It's true in my school, it's true in most schools, where students just want to be fed the answers they need to succeed in their career. So there's not what I saw 30 years ago when I started being a professor, the kind of excitement about learning, the ferment of ideas, learning things that go against what you believe and how you resolve that I've seen both in my own experience and at the University of Chicago when I started. That's because education is so damn expensive and students go into debt, and God damn it, they want some return on that. And the return is not, the intellectual excitement of examining your worldview when it's challenged. It's learning what you need to get into med school and stuff. And so you lose that sense of wonder along the way. You just want the facts but I'm not an expert in this area. So I just, give the facts of evolution as I know them in a way that I think is palatable. But, evolution is the least damaging thing that religion, creation is the least damaging thing that religion foists on people. So, that's one reason I wrote that book, is because there's a lot of things about religion that are far more injurious than simply telling kids that evolution didn't happen. Nobody has ever died from believing in creationism, but a lot of people have died from believing in that God can cure them by praying. So,
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We
Sure.
really appreciate it, and we'll see you again sometime.
my pleasure.
Thanks.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.